Emergency service dispatchers, what is the creepiest call you have ever gotten? One of the first calls I ever took. Woman calls up and asks about the process of filing a restraining order. She discusses how her boyfriend has been abusive and controlling. Mid-conversation, the doorbell rings. She puts me on hold, opens the door, and I hear yelling. Guy barges in and starts beating on her, and I'm sitting there helpless listening because I didn't have her address yet. Luckily, I did have her name, and within a few minutes we got her address and got help to her. She was pretty badly injured but lived, and he is still in jail. That call made me doubt myself and if I was in the right profession, but I stuck with it, and it has been a very rewarding, though sometimes sad, profession. Story 2, one that always sticks with me, is the guy who phoned to tell me he'd shot himself. It seemed like he was joking, he was slurring his words and sounded drunk. But no, he'd actually did and was dead by the time the crew got there. That was a weird one to get my head around. I also took a call from a 15-year-old kid who came home from school to find his dad died. So I had to basically ask him if he was cold, could he cut him down, all the usual while this poor kid was panicking. And then the kid stops answering my questions. And the dispatcher next to me gets the emergency call from the neighbors saying they don't know what's going on, but there's a kid standing in the street just screaming. I think about that poor kid a lot, and I absolutely detest his father for doing that to him, when he knew his son would be the one who'd find him. Probably the other one that stands out is the call from the woman who'd just been abused. She'd been coming home from a club, and someone had pushed through her door behind her as she unlocked it. When he left, she called me. I still remember the way she screamed when she heard knocking on her door again. And I had to yell at her to try to make her understand it was the police and not the guy coming back. I didn't sleep well after that night shift at all. Commentaire? My kid sister got a call last year from her best friend when he came home from school and found his dad unconscious and in the tub. I'm incredibly proud of her because she walked him through putting pressure on the wounds and keeping his dad warm, while she was also on another phone to the paramedics. Then, when the paramedics arrived, she told her friend to make sure the back door was unlocked, and she went over and cleaned up the blood so the kid and his mom didn't have to deal with it. Story 3. Caller. Muffled voice. Me. I can't understand you. What's the location of the emergency? Caller. Sounding clearer, like Kermit. The frog gives address *, I'm going to die. Me. Sir, we can help you. Talk to me. What's been happening? Please, there's nothing that can't be. Crack. Silence. I had to stay on the line until I heard police on scene. He had a hands-free kit on. I wasn't even allowed 5 minutes break. I had a breakdown after. I can't describe those sounds. Haunts me to this day. I cannot describe the feeling of being so intimately involved in the moment of such a traumatic death. He gave his pain to me. Death calls were common, part of the job, but this was so sudden. I was the last voice he heard. Also, it was 2 a.m. on Xmas Day. I was wearing a Santa hat, looking forward to seeing my family. I had to cancel and went home, spend the day alone and shaking. I can't share this with people I know. I don't want to spread his pain further. Now I have PTSD. Story 4. I work for a sheriff's office, and a good friend of mine was a dispatcher. I stepped outside one day for a smoke, and my buddy was standing there shaking and crying. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that he had just dispatched a call for his best friend. His friend was a former Army sniper and had only been out for a few months. He was a volunteer firefighter and was responding to a house fire, rolled the truck, and had been died. Guy had 5 young daughters. He ended up getting fired in the most epic way possible. One of the other dispatchers was the granddaughter of the jail administrator. She was young and very cute, and he was kind of goofy, but seriously funny. Well, they had been flirting for a few weeks, and one day he just up and got fired. Come to find out, he had corrected her on something that she was doing incorrectly, and she got butt hurt, and figured she could get him moved to another shift. What had he done? He had texted her a pic of his scrotum with the caption of, "I'm nuts about you," about a week earlier. Yeah, that didn't sit well with the brass / her grandpa. Fired. Story 5. Was a 911 operator for 10 years. Scariest is probably different than worst. My scariest was an active shooter in a high-rise. Just sitting on the line trying to give the best directions so everyone makes it out okay. Another 2 stories. When I first started out, I worked for a rural county, and some areas were very far from help. One night I got a call from a group of people who were in a 3M accident, and their car caught fire. The girl I was speaking with was stuck in her seatbelt, and as the fire spread, she was in terrible amounts of pain. She kept begging me to send help, and I was, but it was far away. I stayed with her until the phone dropped. Assumingly the phone and it melted or malfunctioned. The father called me for a welfare check, and I was putting in the call when he got to the house. He said the door was unlocked, so I stayed landline while he went inside and he found his son. The pain in the moment he walked out and told his wife was so horrible and raw. Story 6. From the last time I answered this, a woman called, screaming her head off that she had driven into a body of water. Her car was filling up with water. She couldn't open the door. She didn't know where she was, etc. Kids in the car were all going to die. Meanwhile, I'm like, what do I do now? Try to find out details about where she is. We know she can see a massive shopping center, but it could be anywhere even remotely close to that. Local units all fan out to the different large ponds, streams, etc. it could be. Call the Coast Guard and Marine support units to help. Try to find out what kind of body of water it is, how big it is, etc. And she is just too panicked to answer any questions whatsoever. Managed to get the registration of her vehicle, and that was it. Turned out she had driven into a flooded road, flooded from rain, not anywhere near an actual body of water. Absolutely zero danger of the water going past her knees. Story 7. A kid was at a campground with her family, and they let her out of their sight for 20 seconds, and she wandered down to a creek and drowned. Her mom found her, and her father called in. While I was getting details from the understandable, distraught father, a random guy camping there was doing CPR managed to resuscitate her. I can't imagine how her parents felt, but it was like physical weight being lifted off of me. Story 8. My sister works as a dispatcher. Her first week on the job, she had a man call in saying he was going to take her own life. He told her that she couldn't do anything to change his mind. He was simply trying to let her know where he could be found. She heard the gunshot through the call. Second one, she had a little girl call in because her dad was unresponsive. She knew that CPR would likely save this man, but the daughter wasn't grown enough and didn't have the strength to perform it effectively. My sister had to tell her to leave the room, because the longer that girl stayed in there trying fruitlessly to save her father, the more scarred she would become by the experience of watching her father die. Story 9. Not a dispatcher, but a paramedic. But a man called saying his mom had severe chest pains. So we head over to their address in a hurry. However, there was no mom, just the caller waiting for us and then robbing us at gunpoint saying B were going to kill us. He just wanted the substances, but was quite shocking still. Always going through my mind when entering some shady neighborhood. Story 10. I think the most genuine terror comes from child callers. I had a girl call in that her dad was growling and wouldn't wake up. Okay, agonal breathing. Probably a heart attack scrambling to get a confirmed address for EM's PD dispatched to unconfirmed address. Finally, confirm the address and start giving directions on CPR. Nope. She will not touch him because she is scared, then bursts into tears. Luckily, PD arrived just after she refused, and they were able to do CPR until EMS arrived. Story 11. 911 dispatcher here for a large city. I get a little bit of everything, and mostly it's BS. But one that stuck with me was something recently. A man called in frantic, and it was really hard to get him to calm down. He told me his 35-year-old girlfriend was unresponsive and not breathing. I immediately started giving this guy CPR instructions, and he kept screaming, I'm sorry, my love." Tough morning for the guy, no doubt. It hit me that he could have been responsible, or the last thing he ever said to her was not pleasant. Never followed up on the call. In this line of work, it's on to the next one. Too busy to think about it. I have millions of people depending on me not to let the last call affect the next one. I don't know what happened other than she was a doa. Didn't hit me until the next day. That scream was deafening. All I know is there was more to the story. I could hear it in his voice. Story 12. Not a dispatcher, but one told me that one time he got a call from a 19-year-old girl. It was late and she was new to driving, in the US. Her car slipped on black ice and went over the bridge. Her car sank in the river, and she called 911, and he received it. He tried to keep her calm. The poor girl was an au pair from the same country in Africa. She was crying because she was going to die in a foreign country, and to make things worse, she didn't even know where she was. They couldn't find her fast enough. The dispatch even remembers her last words. Tell my sister I'm sorry I left. This story hunts me to this day. I'm also an au pair. Story 13. Call came in and was flagged as a frequent caller on the ass end of a very rural county. The dude was just screaming. We couldn't make out anything he was saying, but we had his address and sent every available unit we had. After a while, the screaming started to die down and his breathing got very labored. He wouldn't talk to us, but he just kept muttering. After a few minutes, we realized he was praying. A few minutes later, deputy arrived on scene. Heard him check in on scene and also heard him on the line. First noise I heard was him vomiting. Turned out the dude had been working on his car and the lift collapsed. The guy wasn't under the car, but was between it and a tree when the car started rolling. He was impaled on a branch and pinned between the tree and car. Dude lived. He's a quadriplegic, but he's alive. First legit 911 call he ever made, and everyone took their sweet time getting there because it was usually nonsense. Story 14. I worked as a jailer for a while after getting out of the Marines. We had a dispatcher who had 2 kids. Both boys, one a pause that was always in jail, the other younger troubled and riding a dangerous line. She got the call one night that her younger son got shot twice in a deal gone wrong at a public park where he was playing ball. He was dead before the helicopter got in the air, most likely. The dispatch center was connected to the jail where she had to work less than 50 yards from the man who shot her son. She was pretty tore up. Story 15. I am no longer a 911 dispatcher, but the hardest one I had was a call from a gal screaming over and over, "He is going to do it." The call comes in on an uninitialized cell phone. This is basically a cell phone with no plan, but you can still call emergency service. It is not uncommon for these to be handed out to abused victims as a way to call for help that their abuser doesn't know about. But it also means we have no information on this phone at all. It doesn't have a phone number. The cell phone is pinging off only a single tower out in a rural part of the county, so I can't triangulate or really narrow down a location beyond a certain radius of that tower. With any call, we are taught to get the address first, and I'm trying, but the shotgun blast goes off, nearly deafening me, and she just starts screaming and occasionally gets out, "He did it." I pieced together that her husband was threatening to die and finally did it while I was listening in and she was watching. But try as I might, I cannot get her to calm down enough to give me an address. I am also dispatching the law enforcement units in the area at the same time, so I have them heading to the area. But the nearest one is still 20 minutes away from the tower, so I am at least trying to get them in the area for once I have more. Eventually, I did get her to calm down a little and got an address. I also spoke with her enough to learn that their children were in the home, and I walked her through getting them out of the house without seeing all of that. It took so long for the officers, and by the time they had the volunteer firefighters hadn't responded. In many areas, there was only a couple, and they aren't available all the time, so sometimes no response. During all that, I still had officers doing traffic stops and had to read them back their returns on plates and running IDS. There was a code with CPR going on elsewhere, so my partners were all tied up as well. It was a tough night, and I was just out of training at the time. Others that stick with me, a girl got kicked by a horse, and I could hear agonal respirations in the background as her friend gave me the address, which wasn't valid. There was no horse facility by the name she gave me on the road. In this case, the cell signal was bouncing all over, and I had nothing. It took me way too long to figure out it was a skip from another county, and while we had a street with the same name, I didn't know they weren't even in our area and needed to be transferred, time that her friend spent dying. Anyway, there were lots. They were frankly harder than the calls I run now as a volunteer firefighter in EMT training right now, because at least now I can physically do something about what is going on. My colleagues complain about dispatchers a lot, but they don't get it. They don't understand how hard the job can be and the effect it can have. The general opinion is they are fairly dumb and sit in a cushy chair talking on the phone all day and giving us little to no, and often wrong, information, or just give us crap on the radio for things like requesting law enforcement backup right now. Then they just ask what the reason is, as you are getting attacked by a patient who just was doing, but you gave him Narcan, and he miraculously not only can breathe and has a pulse again, but is strong enough to start breathing the crap out of you. The truth is that what we get from them is 100x better than the crap info we are getting. Just getting an address is hard, and no one else can do anything without that. I really appreciate them and get pissed off when other first responders don't want to consider them a first responder. I will go to the mat for them at any time. Very appreciated. Story 16. Obligatory, not an emergency dispatcher. I had a conversation with one once where we discussed his craziest work stories, and his was taking the call of a man who had just killed his 2 daughters near their house. He had to stay on the phone with this sociopath, asking him questions about the time and location of the murders, until the police arrived to take him into custody. He never found out if they ever found the children, or if either of them survived in the end. I've come into contact with a fair number of predators/molesters in my line of work, but I never had to interact with them immediately after their crimes and press them for details. It's a lot to ask of someone. I've always had a lot of respect for emergency dispatchers and the folks who run abuse and died hotlines. Story 17. Nearing the end of a rather uneventful night shift, I took a call from a young lady who frantically announced that she was going into labor. There was nobody there with her. Her apartment door was locked, and it was apparent that delivery was imminent. Childbirth calls are quite rare. For emergency medical dispatchers, they are said to be once-in-a-career occurrences. We are nonetheless trained for this, so when the call does come, we are prepared to help the caller through delivery of the baby. What I wasn't prepared for, however, was helping a would-be mother deliver her own baby. Thankfully, by the time I finished obtaining all the geovalidation information and pertinent medical history, a few minutes into the call, I could hear someone knocking on her door. It was her sister, but she couldn't get in because the door was locked. The caller insisted she was not able to go unlock the door on account of her being in active labor. I managed to convince her to crawl to the door to let the person in, and she painstakingly did so while voicing her discomfort in the form of various moans, grunts, and profanities. She finally let the other person in and handed the phone to the visitor. Relieved because I now knew what to do, I started providing the preparatory instructions. Gather pillows, towels, blankets, removing clothing from the waist down, etc. But there was no time for prep. That baby was coming, and it was coming now. "The head is out," I remember hearing, followed by her shrieking, oh crap," and a lot of obscene words. Within moments, baby was born, but the baby was limp, blue, and not breathing. After what felt like minutes, but was likely only a few seconds, I decided to advise the caller that she would need to start doing chest compressions. Thankfully, before any of that started, I could hear the reassuring sound of a baby crying on the other end of the phone. With excitement in her voice, she announced that baby was moving and the color was improving. It was a baby boy, and he was alive. The paramedics arrived, and I congratulated the caller before disconnecting the call. By this time, it was past the end of the shift, and the day crew had logged on at all the desks except mine. Instead of going home, the night crew had gathered around my desk to watch me take this call. After disconnecting, I was met with cheers from my colleagues. During my next shift, I was informed that baby was healthy, and I was presented with a congratulatory letter and a little blue stork pin. Story 18. My mother worked dispatch and got a call from a woman whose husband had locked in a trailer and lit it on fire. The windows had been boarded up, and there was no way for her to get out. This was in the 90s, so landline and the call cut out when the cord started to burn. By the time fire and police arrived, it was too late. The best she got was from a woman who was very active labor. My mom had to talk her and her teenage daughter through delivering the baby. By the time Ems got there, they had healthy baby boy. Story 19. Not a dispatcher, but when I used to work as a bouncer, I wound up calling 911 several times, trying to remain calm for an overdose and shooting, and in one case, a brutal curb stomping. While talking to the 911 dispatcher while everyone around me was very much not calm was rough. My own life's been saved a couple times by quick and professional dispatchers. And frankly, they don't get enough love or credit. Story 20. Not a dispatcher, but trained in advanced CPR first aid. I almost became decided to do other things. I was truck driver for very local company, was driving back at into my loads. I could hear people on radio. It's usually really quiet. I hear there is like a 3-car accident up ahead. I came up over a hill and saw a van sitting on its rooftop, car rolled. I pull over, put 4 ways on grab my first aid. Trauma bag I carry around everywhere, you never know. Everyone but the people in the van are fine. Had one occupant trapped in the van, other 3 was in complete shock. One of the 3 that could get out had a fractured bone. I grabbed some gauze, told him to hold it there. 2 of the others just had scratches on them. I ran to the van as they said another was stuck inside. I get to him, he broke his neck eye from what I could tell at the time. He was alert, but barely. I asked him his name, he knew it. I grabbed my phone and proceeded to call 911. I told them I needed a life flight here. Gave them exact mile marker. They asked all the questions to me. Told them had a around 50-year-old male in critical condition, had blood coming out, was barely alert and failing. Gave phone to other bystanders as I tried to get him stable. His pulse was very weak. I stayed there until paramedics came. I went back to the person that had bone fractured and made sure he was okay. Everyone lived, but the person in the van, he died en route to hospital via life flight. At that time, I was wearing my company uniform, and it's white mainly. I get back into my truck and bawled my eyes out, as I knew he was probably not going to make it. I get back to the dock, and I have blood on my shirt and blood on my pants. I shut off truck, go in, and the boss is like, "What damn happened to you?" I filled him in. He told me to go home. Don't worry about the paperwork, he would do it. I am driving home an emotional wreck. I swing by the bar as it's a block from my house and grab a drink. Luckily, it's finally dark out and no one can see the blood. I go home and wife was wondering what took me so long to get home. I walk into the house and she sees the blood and I told her everything. Then I collapse of exhaustion. I call off work for rest of the week. I get paid for it. I go to work the next week and I'm put on warehouse duty for a couple weeks with same pay and a lot less stressful. I carry my bag everywhere. Story 21. When I was younger, I applied to be a 911 operator for the city I was living in Northern California. I got through most of their tests and interviews, which there were numerous. The pool of applicants was over 200 for about 8 positions. I got down to the last dozen applicants, then they played some recordings for us. The recording I listened to was a young girl calling 911 from inside a closet. She was crying and hysterical, saying that her dad was in the house with a gun and was going to kill her mom. You could hear the mother screaming in the background, and the operator was really calm and collected. She got the little girl to keep her voice down and whisper and tried to keep her on the line. You could hear the gunshots in the background. I couldn't listen to it anymore. I didn't want to find out what happened next, so I don't know the outcome. I knew I couldn't handle that then. I don't think I could take something like that now. Story 22. I was an alarm dispatcher for about a year. Scariest I had was during the night shift. I had a woman whose alarm went off while she and her daughter were asleep. She grabbed her daughter and ran into her room and locked the door. She had a gun. The woman said she did not know why it went off and requested we dispatch the police. Protocol for the company I was with was for us to stay on the line with them while a seat neighbor called the police for us. About 30 seconds after we began the call for the police, she said the door handle was being jiggled from the outside and stopped after a few attempts. She kept saying she was going to go out there no matter how many times I told her to stay in the room. The last 30 seconds of the call, she was not responding. I hung up with her and called the police back and asked what was going on. They advised that police were on scene. Worst part about that job was not knowing what happened after we hung up. Glad I'm not there anymore. Story 23. Had to listen to a guy try and give CPR to his wife after she take her own life. Luckily, I worked for the police and not EMS. I was just listening to make sure the gun was secured and that the man didn't do anything crazy before my deputies arrived. I still think about that call a lot. Story 24. There's a guy up here on the roof. He was wandering around in a daze and not responding to me. He's got his shirt off and he's sitting on top of the parking garage with his legs over the edge and he's rocking back and forth. He's covered in blood. Vehicle pursuits aren't fun either. Story 25. A little late to the thread, and not exactly what is being looked for from the question, but I was training to be an EMT and was on a ride along. We show up to the scene, and the only thing told to us was that it was a load and go, which meant rapid transport. I find the guy and he's making a wheezing noise trying to breathe. Turns out he had a brain bleed and was having severe symptoms of high intracranial pressure. The ride to the nearest trauma center was only about 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 hours as we just tried to keep him from dying on his own vomit. With something like that, we couldn't really do much except hope we made it in time. It was definitely a wild experience for a ride-along, and the craziest part was just cleaning up all the vomit in the ambulance and quickly moving on to our next call. It's definitely not something I'll ever forget in my lifetime. Story 26. Not EMS, but work for a domestic violence shelter that offers assault services. We'll never forget talking to this one woman, and her husband came home during the call, and she must have dropped the phone in the process. But then I could just hear her screaming and him yelling. That will stay with me forever, I'm sure. I really wish we had been able to get her help before that happened. That is the worst call I've had, but I find it so hard when children call. Just always breaks my heart. Story 27. Not 911, but handled a phone where we directed people to resources. Had a lady call me asking what resources were available for someone who had been passed out cold on her chair for 2 hours. I told her to call 911. Story 28. Scary in a different way to Lost. When I first started as a fire service 999 call handler, I got told to listen in to a call by my officer in charge. She said, "You need to hear this." It was a call from the police advising of a death attempt in a park in our county. I've struggled with my mental health and depression for years, so it hit home. It scared me because of that and the way my OEC told me I had to hear the call and hearing how blunt it all was. It hit me that in the time I'd cycled to work and thought, damn, it's chilly tonight, this poor dude had decided his time was up and took his own life, in the dark, in the cold, alone. I'll never forget that job. I'll never forget that dude. Never met him, never saw him or spoke to him, didn't even know his name, but I'll never forget him. I sat at home the next day and just contemplated things. Scared the crap out of me, thinking that was what my career future looked like. Calls like that. I've since taken calls where people have had to fight for their lives in fire and road traffic collisions. I've talked people through emergency first aid and trauma care, and I guess I've probably helped save some lives. Story 29. I've taken too many terrifying calls to count that stick with me every day, but I had a guy tell me one time that he was going to cut me up and kill me. Not so much scary to me, but hilarious. Story 30. A little backstory. My dad owns a mechanic shop in a pretty well-known college town. Fixes cars, helps customers, and whatnot. He sometimes brings work home, brings a customer's car back home to finish working on it. In this instance, it was my mom's car. I wasn't out there to see what happened. All I heard was my dad calling my mother's name as loud as he could. That caused my mother and I to run out to our garage, which was attached to the house, and see him under the car. Now I've been to his shop before and have seen him under cars working on them. I thought this was normal. I didn't see what happened other than my mom screaming at me to call 911. I called while I was crying, mind you, I was in the 5th grade at the time, and told them my dad was under a car and all the important things. After I called, I come to find out that the car was propped up with a jack stand, and the stand fell, which made the car fell. Thank goodness for adrenaline, because my dad was able to slightly lift up the car and pull himself out before paramedics and the fire department showed up. After a hospital visit, surprisingly nothing was broken, punctured, etc., except a soreness that lasted a good 6 months. I see my dad as a strong man, having been in the military and seeing conflict in another country, but yet he says to this day that that was the scariest experience of his life. Story 31. Not a dispatcher, but a firefighter. About 3 months ago, we got a lift assist call at a residence in a spaced-out neighborhood. This was around 2 a.m., and it was our weird weather season. We roll up in our engine, but our captain tells us to stay in the cab for some reason. He sounded kinda off when he said this, but he needed 2 volunteers to go with him to see what the situation is with the EMTs. A lieutenant and I both volunteered to go with him, and as we're stepping off the truck, I got a bad gut feeling. We had to walk through a forest patch to get to the residence, and the only thing guiding us is the flashing lights of the ambulance in the distance. We finally make it to the property, but there wasn't anyone in sight. Our captain tried talking on the EMT crew's radio channel, but nothing except for silence. We follow him around the back of the residence, all seeming to share the same bad feeling. We step into the back patio, and there is a medical kit and used latex gloves on the patio table. My captain shined his flashlight through the glass door in the back and didn't offer any concerning reactions. The captain tries talking on his radio again, but still met with silence. Then, out of nowhere, a paramedic comes within our view with blood on her shirt. She says in a shell-shocked way that everything is under control and they don't need us. My lieutenant grabbed my shoulder and pushed me behind him. My captain began whispering with the paramedic, and he nodded, and we left. Story 32. Not me, but someone that shared their story one day. They received a call from a woman whispering down her phone, stating that there were intruders in her house. She was hiding down the side of her bed. They were downstairs, and she was upstairs in her bedroom. She kept quiet for 10 minutes, keeping the call handler updated through whispering. She then told the handler the men were coming up the stairs. Next thing the handler hears is the woman saying, "Please don't hurt me." The handler hears a noise that sounds like a scuffle and voices, but can't quite hear what they are saying. Then it suddenly goes completely silent. Except there's this noise that sounds like the wind blowing through an object, followed by a quiet gurgling noise. Turns out the wind noise was the sound of the poor woman trying to breathe through her lacerated windpipe as the air pumped up from her lungs, pushing it out through the wound in her neck. The intruders had decided to beat her in the neck upon finding her and then continue to rob the house. That story left me with a bad feeling for the rest of the day. Story 33. Not a dispatcher, but thank you to them. I was 12 when my mother's ex-husband's mother was dying in our living room at 2 a.m. No one in the household spoke English, except my sister and I. I was the eldest, so they woke me up and told me to help. I went downstairs, called 911, and told them something was wrong with the old lady. They asked me to check if she was breathing, so I walked over to her and was about to put my hand over her mouth when I see the ants crawling in and out of her nose and mouth as she was exhaling a loud growl, kind of like how movies depict possessed people. I must have screamed because the next thing the dispatcher told me was to go outside and wait for paramedics to arrive. Asked me if I had a sweater and shoes on, asked me if it was too cold, then asked me if there were any other kids in the house. I told her my sister was upstairs sleeping. She told me to let her keep sleeping and then told me she wondered what she was dreaming. I will never forget what I saw, but I don't know how bad it got because of that dispatcher. She kept my mind off of it and just had a conversation with me until help arrived. Once they arrived, she told me I was brave and incredibly smart for helping out. Turns out she was having a heart attack and was probably about to die. My call saved her life for another 4 years that she used to continue to torment me. Story 34. On my very last night of clinicals for being an EMT, I was sitting in the back of the ambulance and the paramedic and EMT got out to go to the bathroom, and the paramedic gave me a very quick rundown of how the computer worker, by far the coolest group I was with through my 48 hours of clinicals. It was about 2 a.m. All of the sudden, the thing starts beeping really loud and making all kind of noise. Then the EMT come running out and jump in, and we started off with light and sirens and all. The paramedic looks back and tells me that we're going to a possible shooting. We get their very upscale neighborhood. About 3 fire trucks and 12 police cars outside this house middle of the night. Made it seem like day outside. We get out all the equipment, get the stretcher, and run up there. As I walked in, there was a guy laying on the floor and he took 2 last breaths. Agonal breaths. What this guy did was just sitting there with his wife after dinner and pulled a 9mm out and shot, then had a hypnic git that caused him to shoot again. Then when the firefighters got there, they pulled him off the couch. He was laying on and started doing CPR. All in all, the paramedic was very cool about it, while the police were securing it as a crime scene. Story 35. A few stand out, but the first one that comes to mind was a young woman who called in because she was hearing noises outside at night. I got her address and information. She was relatively calm at this point, but a few seconds later, she saw there was someone outside in her yard coming up onto her porch. She's getting more freaked out. I'm telling her PD is already on the way. I've taken dozens of calls like this, and usually once they realize someone is awake, they run off. This guy didn't. There was a loud crash. She starts this high-pitched scream and stops responding to me on the phone. Turns out the guy smashed through her front window. She dropped the phone and ran to the bathroom. PD got on scene quickly, thank God, and found the guy still hung up in the window. She was okay, just freaked out. He went to jail. But that crash and scream are sounds that stick with you. You kind of become numb to things after a while. What would be scary for most people is just normal for most of us. It's a stressful job, and at our agency, we both take the calls and work the radio at the same time, so sometimes you may take 100, 200 calls in a shift. It's impossible to remember them all, so the ones that do usually either really bad or really funny. Story 36. One of the scariest, most memorable calls was probably when I had to stay on the phone with the father of a barricaded subject. Army vet, while they relayed to me what they were able to see through the in-home security footage. The wife of the subject left, went to the house of the father of the barricaded subject, without telling the subject because she saw him, the subject, standing over their baby girl with a gun the day before. We had to put out an all-points bulletin to notify the surrounding area that he left the house at one point, possibly going to find his wife and daughter. He went back home and started tearing the house up and smashing things. I had to hear from my officers that he was shooting at them from inside his house. Eventually, we got him out without anyone getting injured. I ended up having to be on the phone for a solid 4.5 hours, unable to hang up and unable to go to the restroom or leave when my shift ended. I tried to block out the calls that I listened to people kill themselves and others. Story 37. Not a dispatcher, but this was a local news story. A few years back, there was a guy that was wanting to scrap an oil drum eark. When he started cutting into it, it blew up and he caught on fire. He ran down to a nearby creek to put himself out. He passed a few days later in the hospital from the injuries. It had to have been a horrible, horrible day for everyone involved. Story 38. My brother used to do dispatch. He told me about 3 stories that messed him up. The first was a call from a man in a rural area whose wife had a heart attack. He said all you could hear while the man performed CPR was him sobbing, "Please don't leave me. You can't leave me yet. She died." The next one was a mother who walked in on her son who was in process of dying. He was still alive and kicking, and the mom froze. My brother desperately tried to get her to cut him down or put a chair under him or something, while police and medical responded, but she didn't. He died. The last one was a call from a 4-year-old who wanted help because her dad was beating her mom on her birthday. She hid in a closet and called, and he tried to talk to her to figure out her name and address and stuff. Before he could get info to get anywhere, her dad found her. All he heard was yelling before the phone call ended. He's had more that I'm sure were difficult, but these are the ones that gave him nightmares. I still think about them regularly, TBH. Story 39. My late wife was a 911 dispatcher for 15 years. The 2 worst I remember her telling me of were a call she didn't answer, but was on duty during and heard the playback of. A woman called that her ex-boyfriend was breaking into her house, and he then beat her to death, all of which was heard on the phone. When they heard it, they weren't sure what it was, but found out when the officers arrived. The second was when she was doing EMS calls. A man had recently had surgery on his legs and was unable to get up out of bed or his recliner by himself. He calls because his wife is having a heart attack on the other side of the room and he can't do anything to help her. She said listening to him begging for help was the worst thing she ever had to sit through. Story 40. I worked as a deaf relay operator, 611. So we would often get 911 calls when people dialed the number wrong. We have to stay on the call and get them to 911 and can't leave until call is concluded. Guy is super tired trying to catch a few winks on the side of Interstate 5 when a car pulls up behind him and people jump out and try to get in the car. He drives off and calls 911 and the car follows. They're speeding down the road and he's giving the dispatcher the name of every exit he just passed, and he's saying the car is still behind him and at times is trying to pull side by side. He's scared crapless. I'm on the edge of my seat. The call drops. Story 41. Not emergency services. I was the bed manager of a hospital. I got a phone call on the major incident phone. A 12-carriage train had completely derailed and fell 20 foot down the embankment at speed. A short time later, I was informed it was haulage, at which point my A-hole retracted. We would have had to use the car park, which was being discussed as there was under 10 beds available. No HDU beds, no ITU beds, no neuro beds, and no beds in ortho wards to boot. Story 42. It sounds like a joke, but I've got a call from the guy who wakes up in his backyard and finds his legs gone and doesn't remember anything for the last few days. Said he had a hallucination about someone digging into his lower body with their fingernails. Story 43. Not really scary, but creepy. I got a 911 open line from a landline, and when that happens, our computer automatically populates the address, phone number, homeowner's name, etc. Our policy is to send police for any 911 hang-ups or open lines from landlines since we have the address. So the deputy gets there, and the house is completely vacant and has been for a long time. I remember the open line being just silence, so nothing really weird there. The weird thing is, the deputy said has been there before for suspicious calls from neighbors saying they saw things in the house. The deputy told me he believes it's haunted, and that's possibly the reason for the 911 open line, but who knows. Story 44? I took a call for a subject in an armored vehicle with multiple semi-automatic rifles on a major highway crossing over a tourist destination. Probably the most scary call I've ever taken. Story 45. I was working at a small agency during a storm. We would work one person in dispatch per shift. As it was pretty common to go an entire overnight shift without a single call. The local hospital called and said, a tornado just hit the hospital. Turns out, the tornado dropped directly on top of the hospital, moves across the street to the college dorms, and destroyed at least one of them. There must have been multiple naders because all of our phone lines lit up and everyone was saying a tornado just hit their house. The town close by had a couple fires. Our paging system went down, meaning no paging out our volunteer fire guys, 3 officers in total for the entire county, and all of our medics tied up at the hospital. The calls would go like this: Are you injured? Do you feel safe enough to drive yourself to the hospital? If they said yes, I'd tell them to make their way to the staging area at the hospital. If no, I had to write it down and have one of the other agencies sending help to check on them. Luckily, the college was on an extended weekend, so hardly anyone was in the dorms. I still have anxiety issues when I'm at work when a storm hits. Story 46. I didn't take this call, but I was the K, so I had to review it. Guy calls in and says he had just shot his dad, and that now he was going to take his own life. He was creepy, calm. The dispatcher tries finding out if the father is dead, and the guy tell her that he unloaded his gun on him, shooting him several times in the back. The guy was not even remorseful. He just kept saying he wasn't going to jail. She had to stay on the phone with him for 45 minutes. Another dispatcher took another call a few minutes after, and this lady is rambling about how her son has mental issues, and she had noticed he had sent her a text, but she hadn't checked it right away. At the time, the dispatcher was a little short with her and asked if there was a problem. Turns out she was his mom. Before calling 911, he had taken pictures of his dead father and sent pictures to his mom, brother, and some girl he had been chatting with. He ended up barricading himself in the house and eventually died. Story 47. I work for a domestic violence agency and have been taking crisis line calls for a little over a year. The worst was when I was on overnights and got a call from a woman whose arm had been broken earlier in the day by her abuser with a giant walking stick. She was terrified and told me she was calling from her abuser's phone, which is a huge safety concern, but he destroyed her phone. I told her to delete the call history once we hung up. She told me she was calling while he was asleep, and at one point, he got up to use the bathroom, and I had her lock the phone and hide it, and hang up if she needed to. He went back to bed, but the waiting was terrible. I tried to talk to her about getting medical help, but she didn't want him to get in trouble. She had burns all over her body that were clearly signs of abuse. I tried to talk to her about our shelter, but she was too afraid to flee. I can't remember how the call ended, but I'll always remember the true fear I felt during that call. I think about her pretty often. Story 48. Heard this story from a cop I knew. Guy calmly calls 911 to report a man standing on his front porch with a shotgun. Police arrive at the address provided to find a man in his 50s standing on the porch as described in the call. They take cover and prepare to shoot if man decides to open fire. Man points gun to his own face. Cops realize what was going on, but it happened too quickly for them to intervene. That man on the porch was the one who called. Story 49, former 000 call taker reporting in. Scariest one would have to be one of the very first calls I took while I was training. A young man rang up, and it was evident from his voice that he was in shock. His exact words were, "I've just hit a motorbike rider who was coming around a blind bend on the wrong side of the road. I think I've killed him." From dealing with a few noise complaints to a car accident with a possible fatality was a massive switch, and this was only my second shift taking calls in training. The motorbike rider did not survive that accident. Second scariest would be when someone was working down a well and was overcome by generator fumes. His wife tried to rescue him, but she fell off the ladder, injured herself as a result, and was unable to help her husband. So, there's one possibly dead male in the well, and his wife is in danger of dying as well. And all of this is in a remote location that I'm completely unfamiliar with. We didn't save the male. We did, however, manage to save his wife. Story 50. Take a call of domestic. Get officers en route. Keep the caller on the phone. Asking questions about weapons in the house? Yes. Does he have any? No. Are you on a cordless phone? No. Keep her talking until the officer gets there. Officer on scene, caller sends daughter out first. Officer on portable telling us what's going on. The caller disconnects to leave the house. Officer screaming on the radio, shots fired, shots fired. Actor had a handgun tucked into his back pocket. As the wife, GF, went to leave, he stepped behind her and shot her. Took a shot at the daughter, missed, and shot at the officer, missed, before jumping back in the house. SWAT called. Officers enter residence. Actor had barricaded himself in the back bedroom, was laying on the bed, waiting. 2 officers hit as they entered. Officers survived. Actor did not, and the GF he shot did not survive. Story 51. I could only do the job for about 6 months. The first one was a 4-day-old baby that basically died when her parents tried force feeding her gripe water as she cried. All our ambulances were out on other calls, so one officer drove to the hospital while another did CPR in the back seat. But she was already dead. That one was really rough. And I had nightmares about my own niece dying for months afterward. Another, a woman had stabbed her teenage son in a fight, and he was running through town to the hospital. Not sure how that one ended. On a lighter note, my 2 favorite calls on Valentine's Day were a man who had applied some novelty sex cream and called us screaming from the bathtub about how badly it burned. Then right before my shift ended, I got to listen to someone vomit over the phone. Story 52. Obligatory posting on behalf of my mom. She answered 000 police emergency calls, Australian 911. The top two, a woman phoned up. She had a restraining order on her ex-husband, had come home to furniture move positions inside the house. Whilst checking rooms, she noticed handprints on the wall leading up to the roof cavity access point. This was slightly ajar. Mom tells her to leave. Woman decides nope. She's Dora the Explorer and gets a chair. She stands on it, starts to lift the cover, and it gets slammed back down. Yep, hubby in the roof. He'd been there a while, days. Second, a call comes in from a remote outback community. Someone's using a machete to stab their way into a door while laughing maniacally. There are no street addresses or house numbers to ID the location, and the caller cannot give a location. Nearest police are 2 hours away. Mom just heard screaming, then gurgling, then silence, then whistling. Story 53. Had a call a couple of years ago where a group of people had entered the country illegally by hopping into the back of a refrigerated lorry. Got a call from one of the group who spoke very basic English and had concerns as he thought one of the guys in the group had died, and the driver couldn't hear them screaming or banging. Didn't even know where they were other than a mile radius from the nearest telephone mast, and they were still on the move. It was scary because trying to get a group of people to work out where they were when they had no windows and hadn't been in the country before, with one of the group members possibly dead. Luckily, an officer had some good hearing and could hear them all banging on the sides after I told them to, on a really busy motorway. Story 54. Anything I answered after 2200 during the Memorial Day tornado devastation. It started, tore through, and devastated Brookville, Ohio, where I live, work as fire, EMS, and is one of the many local agencies dispatched for. Scary night. Thank God for my experienced coworkers. Also sat at work and listened to the Dayton, Ohio shooting a few days ago. That wasn't very fun either. Story 55. I'm repeating a story as well as I can. It's been a while. This man was a dispatcher. Hopefully no longer is, because even recalling this post is god-awful. I can't imagine being in this situation. Man in question was a dispatcher and got a call from a woman whose house was on fire. I'm not sure how it had caught. Dispatcher tries to keep the woman calm, get the address, etc., but is told that the woman's 3-year-old is still in the house. She wants to run back in and save the child, but the dispatcher convinced her that it was better to keep herself and her other children safe. The 3-year-old was crying and screaming for her mother. She ended up dying of smoke inhalation, and this poor dispatcher heard the whole damn thing. Story 56. In my country, the emergency service dispatcher tells you to not keep their line busy, while you tell them you've been kidnapped and beg them to stay with you on the line. So I think this is the scariest thing ever. Story 57. When I started out in the fire service, we were trained as dispatchers. We started in fire alarm and moved out to rescue when we had enough seniority. From there, we could stay on rescue or move to a fire apparatus, but the department provides EMS regardless of your assignment. I honestly don't remember too many tough dispatch calls. I instructed a couple of people through CPR, but they were all pretty calm. In this weird self-pity kind of way, I sort of wish I had something difficult just to sort of ease me in. But when I really think about it, I suppose I'm lucky I hadn't. You see some trauma in the field, but at least you don't feel completely helpless. At least you can do something. Being trapped on the other end of a phone has to suck. Story 58. Not me, but my work colleague told me her worst phone call when I started with her section. She was on the phone to an old lady who was concerned that her 80-plus-year-old brother was going to die, and she couldn't find him. She was on the phone and distraught. My colleague spent a long time calming her down and trying to direct officers to where he might be. She said that she heard the shot over the phone. Officers smashed the door in seconds too late to stop him. She never got over the fact that if she has gotten some bit of information to the officers faster, they might have saved him. Story 59. I'm a volunteer firefighter like my dad. He once told me of a story where a woman on a motorcycle got hit in the side by a truck going 80 kilometers per h. Her upper body was fine, but her lower body were gone. They needed a shovel to get her away. Story 60 wasn't a part of this call until it was time to load the hose back on the truck. But the crew before me got dispatched to a trailer fire, which are sometimes significantly hotter than normal fires. A single family consisting of a man, woman, and child. The 2 adults got out safely except for the child. They did recover the body. Like I said, I only saw the aftermath of the fire, but the thought of what happened just sends chills down my spine. Story 61. My sister was a dispatcher. Pretty early on, she got a call from a woman who found her son after he took his own life. The screaming and crying of this poor grieving mother was unbearable, but she had to stay on the line until police arrived. Suffice to say, it really shook my sister up and definitely made her question if she was up for the job. Story 62. I've taken plenty of calls of people having been shot or having to shoot someone, etc. Took a call for a woman arguing with her boyfriend at a motel, and she walked into the parking lot to call. Pretty basic, but he came outside and started to shoot at her while she was on the phone. I've never been on the phone with someone while they're being shot at. I think I'll never forget her scream. She did not get hit. Story 63. Not a dispatcher, but picked up a call from my friend, and he was drunk, mumbling how he was sorry, and to tell his girlfriend sorry, really just complete gibberish. Anyways, I was on the phone when he died. He was only 15. I often think about this because I sat there and talked to him for hours before trying to convince him it wasn't worth it. I just can't handle it. Story 64. I was only a dispatcher for about a year. The scariest, in a weird way, was one of my first solo calls. A woman called to say the Avon lady was in her apartment building, but she wasn't selling makeup, she was killing people. I will never forget her saying it's not like Ding Dong Avon calling, it's like Ding Dong, you're dead. Story 65. My mom was a 911 dispatcher. Had a guy call in who was having an allergic reaction and could not speak. The system could not trace the call correctly. The guy couldn't speak to say where he was. Wound up dying on the phone with my mom. They found him a day or so later. She had to go on medical disability shortly after for phycology reasons. Story 66. I was working in the air at the time. Dispatch came other, the radio. 6-year-old is unresponsive at the pool. My heart stopped, and that was the first and only time I didn't jump to a call. He was responsive when the ambulance arrived. He just hung out at the hospital for a little bit to make sure he was okay. Story 67. My uncle was a volunteer paramedic, and he responded to a call of a girl who was choking. He tried doing the Heimlich maneuver on her, but it didn't work, so he called his boss and asked if he could cut a hole in her neck so she could breathe, and his boss told him no. Little girl died. Uncle quit.